Glasgow is a magnificent city, said McAlpin. Why do we hardly ever notice that? Because nobody imagines living there. Think of Florence, Paris, London, New York. Nobody visiting them for the first time is a stranger, because he's already visited them in paintings, novels, history books, and films. But if a city hasn't been used by an artist, not even the inhabitants live there imaginatively. So Shanghai is of course a city that has an awful lot of literature, and there's a whole genre called the Shanghai School or Haipai, which is definitely a good example of artists using a city for people who consume their art to live there imaginatively. But in this episode we're going to be thinking beyond just the domestic consumers of Haipai, and thinking about a particular new book coming out in translation into English with a collection of stories all set in Shanghai, and it is The Book of Shanghai, brought to us by Comma Press of Manchester. And here on the episode to talk with me about that book is Karen Wang, the editor of the book. Should be, well, I say should be, I've already had this interview, so I know it was, as always, a really good chat, and there's all sorts of interesting things related to Shanghai that we talked about. So if you're looking for talk about little gems of Shanghai like Suzhou Creek, Suzhou He, or if you want to hear about the little fruit shops of Shanghai and what they've got to do with the very first market reforms in communist China, that's there for you. Or if you're curious to hear about theory of mind, the dissolving of consciousness, and desperate attempts to survive death through the power of words and books, well, that's in the Book of Shanghai too, or at least our conversation about the Book of Shanghai involved those things. So a very interesting chat lies ahead. But first, before all that, we're going to do the TrChFic news. TrChFic, by the way, that's the name of the podcast, if you're a new listener, translated Chinese fiction podcast. So the first little item in the TrChFic news is really something. It's a Chinese language article, so if you cannot read Chinese, you may wish to use your auto-translate to read this one. But basically, it's an article written by Pornhub's very first Chinese language translator. So I'm not going to go into the specifics there, but if you think you want to read that, there will be a link to that in the show notes, the show description. Now, on to more serious news topics. Two other articles that I want to call attention to. The second one is an account from Gregory Lee of his time in China in the run-up to what happened in Tiananmen, obviously the Tiananmen Square massacre, and his interactions with some of the Misty Poets who were, I suppose, intimately involved one way or another with those events that led up to the Tiananmen Square massacre and what came after. Gregory Lee, he's an interesting figure because I'm living near St Andrews right now, and not so long ago a job was advertised for St Andrews' a new Department of Chinese Studies, and Gregory Lee's the guy that bagged the job. So that's all he was to me, plus a name on Twitter. So this article is me, like, my first encounter with his writing, and yeah, not only is it a fascinating kind of insider account of really interesting time, a momentous time in 1980s China, it's also very well written, and there's some really cool pictures there too, so that's worth a read. That's up on Asian Cha. Again, I'll put a link to that in the show notes, but if you want to Google search it, the title of the article is Tiananmen, Lives of the Poets by Gregory Lee, and it's up on Cha, an Asian literary journal. So asiancha.com/wp/article/lives-of-the-poets/ if you wanted the URL. News item number 3, like I said, it's another article, and this one's on kind of a May the 4th theme. So May the 4th has passed us. If you've not listened to previous shows, or if you didn't know, that's the significance of May the 4th globally is not just all about Star Wars and May the 4th be with you. That's a really big date for, I guess, modern China and Chinese literature, because that's when the protest happened that kicked off the May the 4th movement. And the May the 4th movement has been talked about on the show a few times, but most of all, on the 2 episodes we've devoted to Lushun. And this article is all about Lushun. It's called The Revolutionary, and it's up on commonwealmagazine.org. And it's kind of all about the different ways that the figure of Lushun has been understood or used by various people, be it in academia or be it the Chinese government itself. So it's an interesting read. It's pretty short. The Gregory Lee article is a long one. This one is a very quick read. But yeah, it's also good, and there'll also be a link to it in the show notes. Now, our last piece of news is not about something that has happened at the time of recording, but something that is coming up soon. So I'm planning about a week after this episode goes up online to migrate this podcast's feed from SoundCloud to Podbean. So hopefully you guys shouldn't experience any disruption. You should notice better formatted show descriptions. Every show that I put up will have a page, like a proper web page generated. I'll be able to kind of use Podbean as the podcast site as well, which should be great. But if you guys experience any disruption in your feed, if you have any problems, then please do contact me, because that'll be useful for me to know. So yeah, it's a piece of good news, but also a heads up in case there's any disruption. There shouldn't be, but always be prepared. So yeah, that's all the TrChFic news. Let's charge on and listen to my chat with Karen Wang about the Book of Shanghai. So I'm on the show with Karen Wang, the editor of the Book of Shanghai, and it's pretty exciting for me because I don't think we've ever had a book's editor on the show before. We've only ever had authors, translators, but now we've got an editor as a guest, so really exciting. Karen, how are you doing? You having a good day?
Yes, thank you, Angus. Thank you for having me. Yes, we obviously working from home as everyone does in the UK. And so, yes, it's a kind of a standard day where or I do my university work, and now I'm talking to you.
Yep. My day's been kind of similar, and I'm also in lockdown a little bit further north than yourself. So can you tell the listeners and me a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Okay. I work at the University of Manchester, and I work at the Confucius Institute, and I've been working at the university for over 20 years. Obviously moved around, and I worked in the business school, international office, and now I'm part of the School of Arts, Languages and Culture. I came to live in the UK in 1996, so I've been living here for a long time, and I moved to Manchester in 1998. So I've seen the changes of the city. I think now Manchester is becoming very exciting, and especially the cultural scenes. And 2 years ago, we were given the UNESCO City of Literature. And for the last 12, 13 years, we have the Manchester Literature Festival. And also we have a home cinema, and which is, again, a lot of international programs. So it's a really exciting city to live in.
Yeah, absolutely. It was where I did my undergraduate degree, and the predecessor to home cinema, the Corner House, was one of my favorite places. And I think the only time as an adult I've ever had anything I wrote published in a book was by a Manchester organisation. It was a collection of speculative fiction writers. So Manchester is pretty close in my heart too. Do I have anything else to say about Manchester? I don't think so, but it's just cool to have someone who's resident there on the show. Our book for this episode is The Book of Shanghai from Common Press, a Manchester publisher. Can you tell the listeners, and also myself, because I'm quite curious, how you came to be involved with Common Press and The Book of Shanghai?
Yeah, again, I think it goes back to the Manchester Literature Festival. So for the last 12 years, we have been inviting Chinese writers, both from China and the UK-based, to come to the Literature Festival. And it's through these regular activities I got to know Common Press, because sometimes we decide who to invite, and who organized the interviews. And so I think 1 year they were in the process of publishing their China book called 10 and that's how we got involved in very limited way. So so over the years, I've been in regular contact with Ra, who set up the Common Press, as far as I understand. And so I think about 2 years ago, and I sort of said to Ra, I said, would you be interested in publishing a book of Chinese cities? Because I know Common Press is known for their like a city reading series. And I think he showed interest, and it didn't take us very long to decide on the city of Shanghai.
Right.
I think, so that's how we get started.
That's interesting. We might come later back to the question of why Shanghai, but you mentioned that they have other like city readers series, and it's just funny how some things happen either by coincidence or there are some things you only see when you know to look for them. Because just recently I was on Amazon. I don't think I was looking for any like books related to China at all, but the Amazon algorithm was suggesting, it always shows you suggested things you might like, and the book of Tokyo from Comma Press came up, and I think maybe didn't recognize it by its title first. I recognized it by its cover because it's got a similar cover design to the Book of Shanghai. Book of Shanghai has the Shanghai skyline with a nice kind of deep purple color. The Book of Tokyo has, I don't know what the Tokyo skyline looks like, but I guess the Tokyo skyline, and it's more of like a cherry blossom pink sort of color. So right away I thought, oh, that's a funny thing, because in a few days I'm going to be talking on my podcast about Book of Shanghai. So yeah, I guess now I'll ask you, why was Shanghai such an obvious choice for yourself and Ra for like a Chinese city to do a series, a book in their city series on?
Yeah, I think for me is, any books, I think you need to have a readership. So I think, Shanghai is probably the most international city in China. There's so many visitors, especially business visitors and tourists. So I think, that's not a difficult kind of a decision. But most importantly, I think it's because it's a city I'm familiar with. I think, for your first book, if you choose a place which you know very little about, and I think, that's a little bit scary. So for me, I think, at least I think I know the city. Although at that time, I wasn't quite sure how we go about, finding the local editors who can, really have that view in terms of what is happening. But I just feel, this is the city. I want a book, and then people can just discover the city in a much more kind of accessible way, because there's so much figures and images published about Shanghai, but it feels so distant. And I hope this story will give people that kind of more city life. I guess that's why we choose Shanghai.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand what you're saying about feeling a little nervous or unsure how to capture Shanghai in just one little collection of short stories. I spent 2.5 years there, and I was trying very hard I was trying to have fun, but the way I was largely trying to have fun was exploring the city, not just like the famous central areas, but all these little places in the kind of outside the first ring road and even outside the second ring road, because it's such an amazing, fascinating city. There's so much going on. I don't know if you've ever heard of FOMO, FOMO, fear of missing out. Have you heard of that before? Yeah, it's like an acronym for the feeling you feel when you're worried that you're missing on something else going on. And
first time. Yeah.
FOMO. And I felt like, as someone who likes to explore a city, I had permanent FOMO in Shanghai. It felt like somewhere I could maybe live a decade and never completely understand or capture.
It's interesting. Yeah, I think, yes, I'm not originally from Shanghai, and I think, and the time I sort of lived Shanghai, feel I understand it. I think at that time it require language skills, and now maybe it's slightly different. But I think there's some kind of stats and saying, I read it. It says, the kind of foreign residents in Shanghai, it's almost like a 1%, and it's huge. Like it's one resident out of 100 is not a Chinese. So it's unbelievable scale, even for Chinese cities.
Yeah, it's. I mean, in a country like the UK, a 1% foreign population wouldn't seem like a big deal, and even like statistically, 1% isn't. Maybe it doesn't sound huge even in Shanghai's context, but you have to remember or I'm sure I don't have to remind you, but I have to remind myself, the population of Shanghai is so huge that even 1% of that huge population is a massive number. So yeah, you're totally right. It's something that makes it stand out. So you mentioned earlier about working on with Ra on the City series, and I asked a slightly cheeky question to the Comma Press Twitter account. I'm not sure if that's Ra or someone else using it, but when I learned that they had this other book, TrChFic, and I guess an older book about different Chinese cities, I asked whoever's running that Twitter account for Comma Press, are we maybe going to see the book of Hangzhou, the book of Kunming, the book of Tianjin? This was before I knew they had books about like Tokyo and other cities. I mean, this is a cheeky question to ask you as well, but do you think we might ever see the book of Beijing or other Chinese cities?
Yes, I think, after I think a couple of months into the book of Shanghai project, I think we decided we probably want to make it a China series because there are so many other interesting cities, we can do. And I think, for me, kind of as the series editor, my main consideration is, one, I still, for any book to be published, I want there's a reasonable sizable readership. So I think it need to kind of enough interest among the readers and the people who want to know the city. So I think that's one consideration. And the second, I think, is to really see if that city has that kind of very strong, like literary tradition, something, over the years there has been, writers, and although I know every city there are active writers, but whether that had tradition, I think that's also important. And I guess the final one is, because China is so huge, and obviously it can be a project for decades. We can just go city by city, but in the sort of the next couple of years, I think to give it a good geographic coverage, probably it's important. I think, I'm from Hangzhou, so I would like a book of Hangzhou, but to some extent, Hangzhou and Shanghai has a lot of, similarity in terms of the Jiangnan culture, if you like. So I think, yes, there are long tradition of writing in Hangzhou, but I would say if I have to have a second book, I think, it will need to be something probably rather distinctive and different. So I was thinking, maybe very much in the south or very much in the north. So, and then we can slightly kind of, choose cities which are interesting. So we haven't decided anything, but we certainly start to think about it. So that's what my current thinking is. Does that answer your question?
That's a really good answer. My very lazy marketing brain is imagining the Book of Chengdu with just a great big panda on the cover, but maybe that's not what you want to do.
We will see. We'll see. Yeah.
It's nice to know you're from Hangzhou, because I mentioned this on the show before, but the place I lived my first year in China was in Zhejiang, in Deching, near Moganshan. And it was just a small town, and I had other foreign friends and Chinese friends in Hangzhou. You could ride a bus to Hangzhou for just 12 kuai. So I was in Hangzhou not every weekend, but almost every weekend. So probably along with Shanghai, those are the two cities that are strongly written into my memory of living in China. But yeah, I guess like you said, it's a little bit too similar to justify it being the second book. But yeah, I think we've talked enough about the potential of a series. Now we could maybe zoom in on the book itself. Yeah, so since we're covering an entire collection of short stories this time round, I'm going to try a similar approach I did last time I was talking about a collection of short stories on the show. I was talking to the sci-fi author Xia about her collection, A Summer Beyond Your Reach. Just like I did that time round, I'm not going to try and talk about every single story because we'd be here forever. Just going to ask you about 4 this time. And for every story, I've got 2 questions. Before I ask those questions, I would like to ask if you can maybe introduce the story to the listeners and describe the plot, and then we can get into the interesting questions about them. So are you ready to give that a try?
Yes, I'll give it a try.
Awesome. That's what I'm doing every single episode. I'm just giving it a try. So our first of the 4 stories is Fang's Lamp. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about Fang's Lamp?
Okay, yes. So this is a story about the protagonist who, over the years, noticed the change of a very unnamed street, and also the changes of people's life. It started with noticing a fruit store was opened, and then this lady who was selling the fruits to passers-by. There are lots of detailed descriptions of the street and the person, and then her families got involved in, running this fruit store. And then over the years, I think, noticed the changes in that fruit seller Fang's life. Fang has a baby and has a toddler. And so, yes, it's just a really small story, but I guess, it's about change in people's life. That's my reading.
Mm-hmm. And this story is by Wang an author who's resident in Shanghai, right?
Yes, yeah. She's my favorite writers, or one of my favorite writers, and she always writes about Shanghai and the very life of ordinary people living in the city. Yeah.
So my first question about Fang's Lamp was that the story is very early in the collection. It's in the, I forget if it's the very first story, but it's very early in the book. And although it's quite small, not necessarily in its length, but the scale of the story is small. It's not a big epic adventure. It's not about anything really violent or crazy. It's quite small in its scale, quite zoomed in. Despite all that, this one stuck with me, maybe because it struck a chord and some of my own memories of some fruit shops I remember walking past in some different parts of Shanghai. So the question I want to ask is just, did the story stick really strongly in your memory too?
Yes, I think, a fruit store, as you said, you pass one when you live there. And when I lived in Shanghai, I passed one as well. And although in the whole story, there's no mention of where it is in Shanghai, it is a very just common street. It could be any street in any part of Shanghai. And there's no indication of time, but I guess, from the setting, the way it is written, I think this story is most likely happens in the mid-1980s.
Right.
And that's probably the reason why it is the first of the collection. So, but you probably lived there a lot later, but you still can relate to it. So it can be timeless. But when I read it, I think it is something, in the mid-1980s. And that's happened to be the time I live in Shanghai. I went, to study there. And the reason why I think the setting is in the 1980s is, I think, that's kind of China just opened up, and then the economy has transitioned or in the transition from everything state planned to kind of individuals. You can have small economic activities. So individuals are allowed to set up a small fruit store. And especially if Afang, I guess, she's not necessarily from Shanghai, or certainly not from the city of Shanghai. It could be from the suburbs or the other neighboring provinces, and married into the family. So, she hasn't got a job and she wants to support herself. So running a fruit store is probably, a feasible way for her to do so. So I think, that's the settings. And I think Wang, she's very good at sort of writing about those kind of, we might call it working class kind of characters, and small kind of individuals in the big cities. And I think it's so important at that time for the city, because it kind of, people can buy things which is not rationed, and it's kind of, and also it changed people's life, just by running a fruit store. Not only Afang's life, but also the life of the mother and son, who the author believed they were in a very poor state, and then this young lady came along and the life changes. That's how I feel. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier about how 1% of Shanghai, the Shanghai population today, is foreigners. So people like myself when I was living there. But maybe even more interesting is, so when people talk about a migrant worker in the context of China, didn't mean people like me coming in to teach English or do business or whatever. It would mean people from, I guess, usually rural areas or less wealthy provinces going to big places like Shanghai. I never, like in my first year in China, in the small town, I don't think I heard much or ever learned the term migrant worker. But very soon after moving to Shanghai, I learned about, not just about migrant workers, but like the interesting population demographic of Shanghai, that I think most of the people who live there are from elsewhere. They're not from a Shanghai family. And I guess, like you said yourself when you were living there. So I don't think I really have a question with that one. That's just something that sprung into my head when you mentioned that these people are from outside. It also reminded me of someone who I saw every day at work. He was a librarian at the school I was at, and he was from like a long-term, like a family who had lived in Shanghai for generations and generations, and he was quite proud of it. I don't remember seeing any stories in this collection that really went into that. I kind of got the feeling that every character in all the stories in the book might not have been there for that long. I don't know if I'm right about that.
Yeah, I think, Shanghai, it is a city of migrants. I think, it started with the sort of neighboring provinces like Zhejiang and Jiangsu, and then, sort of, over the history of the city development and, from all of China. So I think that probably makes the city interesting, both sometimes, a long time people say, oh, Shanghai is really exclusive, you always feel you're outsiders. And but at the same time, I feel it's also very inclusive, sort of you including everyone who kind of embrace the city and be part of the city. And so I think it is kind of, maybe contradictory itself, but it is, I guess, about migrants' lives and how we make the city as it is. And that's probably why we have chosen a lot of stories who may like a show, they are more kind of transient, I guess.
Yeah, I can understand that, how both things, although they seem to be opposite, are true at the same time. The other question I wanted to ask you, kind of related, also not a fairly simple question just about your experiences. So, from my memory, living in the UK, I've never formed an attachment or a relationship with a shopkeeper because most shops I've gone to, even if it's a small shop, are owned as part of a big chain or they employ other people. There's maybe only been one or two shops I've gone to regularly that are like owned by a family who I've seen often, but it's not been a big enough part of my life that I have any memories of interacting with those people. But I can think of a few different shops in Shanghai where I was able to, I would walk in and the shopkeeper would remember me and we'd exchange some like simple Chinese. So I just wanted to ask you if there's any one shop, a fruit shop or some other shop that during your time in 1980s Shanghai, you were a regular customer who had some kind of like I don't know if friendship is the right word, or even if relationship is the right word, but you had some kind of a bond with the shopkeeper. Do you have any memories like that?
Definitely, yes. I lived on campus, and I remember we have this like a little convenience shop, and the guy who runs the shop, everyone knows him. And I think, yes, you kind of go in, have a chat, and they know about you. It's a very sort of, a close community, I think, especially on campus. There are not many choices or there are many shops you can go. And now I think on campus, you also have a convenience shop, but because now it's all supermarket style, so you go and pick your own stuff. Whereas at that time, you have to say to the shop owner, say, I want that, I want this. And so there's so much interaction. And so, yes, I do remember. And I think another thing is, again, reflected in the story is because these shops are owned by individuals and they know customer service is really important. It's not like a state-run, stores or shops. I remember when I first arrived in Shanghai, and the fruits are scarce, and you sometimes get, buy apples, and they're rotten. And because there's not enough, they can always sell, so they don't really need to give you any custom service. Whereas I found, she sort of want to please the customer, but she's not imposing, not like really aggressive. So she always can sense you're coming, you might have a need, and she will subtly suggest you have this and that. And that's, I think, custom service. And that's when individual economic activity takes place. That's what you get. And that's how your shop owner remembers you, because they want to, you to be their regular customer, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. That's reminded me a little bit of when you mentioned living on campus. Oh, I don't know if you can hear it. Can you hear that plane flying over my head?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's happened a few times in past episodes. I live really near an RAF airbase, Lucas Air Base in Scotland. So yeah, anyway, I'm sure the listeners enjoyed that. The plane seems to be flying away now. I'll just keep asking this question. So I was in Shanghai. I was most of the time I was living on a campus as well, at the school I was teaching at. So there was a street that had most of the shops I'd regularly go to, and one of them was a little convenience shop where I'd often get a drink, whether it's a soft drink or some beer. It was a place to go. And the shopkeeper, I think sometimes it would usually be the husband of this family, sometimes it would be the wife, and once or twice I think I got served by like the teenage son of the family. But the guy especially, he tried really hard. You would see him hanging out with other shopkeepers who lived next door. If a lot of the foreign teachers from the school bought like beer or something from him, he would put seats out on the pavement and he would try and turn his little shop into a bar. And that you can't do that in the UK. I think it would be illegal, but even if you could, I'd never seen customer service like that. A guy who's just so kind of laid back in a way.
But at the same time, very responsive.
Yeah. Not laid back in a negative way. Kind of friendly. I think friendly is the word I'm looking for.
Yes. Okay, good.
Yeah. Okay. So that's Afang's lamp. Here's our next little story. It's the story of Ah Ming. So who's this story by, and what would you say it's about?
Yeah, so the story of Armin actually is my favorite of these collections. It is written by Wang. Before I've never heard of her.
Right.
And I think the reason I like it is one is the story, itself. And the second is she actually, I read both Chinese version because our selection process, we got the Chinese version and I read through it. And I really like the Shanghai dialect coming through the original text. So you can immediately tell this is a story from a Shanghainese, someone who lived in Shanghai, because even Shanghai dialect is not necessarily a written language, but there are certain words people use. And so that come across very strongly and very vividly capture that kind of spirit of Shanghai, and which I enjoy. And then later on, obviously, I discovered, she's the youngest writer of all the writers in this collection. She's in her 20s. So that makes me really excited in terms of people in their 20s, they observe lives on a very kind of micro levels, and but through these stories, they tell the Shanghai story. So what this story is about, I need to go back to what the story is about. So it's the only one which has like a little 9 sections. Most short stories is kind of one whole passage or one whole story, but if follow the Chinese kind of episode, so it's 9 sections in it. And it started when, Armin was found in the rubbish bin. And and then it sort of traces back how her life has changed from as a very neat, nice, sensible lady living in this nice apartment to her current state of basically, living on the rubbish, hoarding the stuff or scavenging things she can sell. So yeah, it's a story about this Armin old lady, the deterioration from a sensible person to someone everyone want to keep distance away from. So that's what the gist of the story.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned that it uses it's got some of the Shanghainese local language on the page, because I didn't know that when I was reading, but now that you mention that, I can remember some kind of like interesting informal English language being used in the story. So if I go back to read this one, I'll watch out for that and see if I can kind of, I don't know what the right way to describe this, but sometimes when I'm reading something translated from Chinese, I'm trying, maybe if I'm not totally focused on the story, my little very limited, my like, how can I say this, my HSK1 or HSK2 Mandarin reading brain will try and see through and guess what the Chinese might have been. And usually I can't guess because my Chinese isn't that good. But if I see some of the informal language, I sometimes wonder, is that because the Chinese was informal, or were they using some like context specific phrase? So yeah, you've given me an interesting thing to look for there, and I guess the translator's done a good job. But what I wanted to ask you, well, there's a lot of things I could ask you about the story. There's also, I mean, gosh, where even to begin? I guess I could just ask you, if this one was your favorite, what made it your favorite?
I think there's a lot said about Shanghai. I think, through the stories, and it's, rubbish. I mean, if people get the chance to read it, it's, Armin obviously live on kind of, activities relating to kind of collecting rubbish, sorting them out and all that. And then the story is set against this big estate she lives in. And then, the very first chapter is all about people hate that rubbish smell, which sort of, disperse into everyone's household because some hot days and the rubbish sort of left overnight and sort of, fermented and all that. And that has always been the city of Shanghai, I think, as much as we liked all the glamorous part of it, but I think, the day-to-day life has a lot to do with producing rubbish and how to clear the rubbish. And I remember I used to live on one of the lanes in Shanghai, the local residents, and we don't have rubbish bins. It's always communal rubbish bins, and people take the rubbish out and throw it there, and everyone trying to throw it from a distance because it's always very smelly. And it is a job really for people probably the lowest of the lowest class to do. People don't have that respect for people collect rubbish, and I think here you just see it as a job, But in Shanghai, it is something which is really looked down upon, and so I think that has been the tradition, and even now people live in these beautiful estate, buildings, but still, that communal beings, which everyone throw the rubbish, everyone trying to keep away from it, everyone think it should be someone else's job to keep it clean and keep the environment clear, nice. And I think that's hasn't changed. So I see this is sort of, something, sort of a continuity of the city, how people see the rubbish and how see it as part of their life, and how see the people who collect the rubbish. And I think the translator did a good job, and they called it the rubbish man, the person who come around to do the rounds of collecting rubbish from these bins. And, obviously the author does not give a specific name, and it's just someone who collects the rubbish. And then the translator called the rubbish man. To some extent, in Shanghai, I mean, probably whoever does this job is considered a rubbish job,
Right. It's something that I, again, didn't think about living in small town China, in the small town in Zhejiang province I was living in. And then even in Shanghai, I got a little more accustomed to how waste is dealt with, but I didn't really kind of wake up to just how different it is from my life in Scotland and the UK until I did a kind of very naive foreigner in China sort of thing. I was asking people, foreign teachers and Chinese teachers in the school I was in, how can I get my things recycled? Maybe we can collect it somewhere. And no one really had a direct answer on what to do. And then I think finally one of the Chinese staff told me, actually the workers on not the teachers, not even the IT people, but like the shufus and ayis who were working on this huge campus in their uniforms were handling the trash. They were the ones that were sorting it. And this wasn't as part of their job. This was a way for them to get some side income. So me as a naive foreigner trying to set up some recycling, I would be, damaging their income. And because it's kind of an embarrassing or sensitive thing to talk about, I had to really kind of chase it before someone would tell me it's better if you don't interfere, because these people aren't paid very much as it is. And as a naive foreigner, it had to be spelled out to me. But it's just another world away from what I was used to.
True. And I think, and also in that kind of chain of labors, there are different roles. So you will have people who, like a cleaner, and when they clean the buildings, people throw out the rubbish, and they will see cardboard, newspapers, and tins and cans. So they kind of will separate them and put them into pile. Then they can sell onto a peddler who usually ride a bicycle and who will call on the estates regularly, say, who has got these things, and you can sell it on for some income, some directly from household. Like my parents, they still collect all the newspapers, and then whenever they got enough pile, they ring this guy, and then that person come and they will weigh the newspaper and give them some money. So I think, if you grown up with this, you will always do it. But younger generation, I think, and they just can't be bothered and they just throw out. So the cleaners get the chance to collect them and sell on to the peddler. And then the peddler, when they collect loads of these, and they send to waste management centers, and they can sell on. So it's like a chain of labors, all people get a little bit income from this. And this is how it works. So, to me, it's, I think, China has been doing recycling quite well until last year. I think 2019, it's a big thing. Shanghai is the pioneering city of sorting rubbish according to probably not exactly the Western way, but now they start to have bins where you put in specific recycling materials into it. So that was only introduced last year, I think, and Shanghai is the first city they try out. And then also they have much more specific recycling policies.
Mm.
Yeah, so that's how things kind of evolve. But I think this story certainly, Amin is one of those ladies who probably at the very bottom of the chain, and who collected and then sell on to the sort of the peddlers, and then she can get some income to subsidize not herself but actually her son, her grandchild. So it's a very traditional kind of, often the elder generation supporting the younger ones, so hoping they have a better life. And so that's how it works.
Right. It's a funny thing. I never thought I might have been someone who was really interested and would be getting some kind of mental stimulation reading about or learning about waste management. But I guess it's because my focus has been so much on modern China. I seem to keep bumping into it. First, there was Chen Qiufan's Waste Tide novel I covered on this show, which kind of deals with e-waste, and I heard him talk about his kind of field research into Guiyu, the town that used to process e-waste, and it was fascinating. And around the same time I read this story, I also did a little bit of freelance proofreading. I proofread an essay by a Chinese, I think a master's or PhD student, a postgrad anyway, writing on metal waste management and recycling in Zhejiang, actually. I think in Taizhou. Taizhou is, I've learned, a huge center for dealing with metal waste, and this paper I helped proofread was all about impacts of new policies. I think policies that have come around the same time as these new waste recycling policies in Shanghai. So I don't really have a question. I just want to say it's way more interesting than I could have ever have expected it to be, and also a reminder of what a lucky or different life I'm living here or upbringing I had here in the UK, where all the waste management was much, much further from me and my nose and my home. Yeah. I guess we've probably talked about waste management enough. Let's go on to our third story. This one's Suzhou River, and this is one I could easily have a very strong guess at the Chinese title. I guess it would be Suzhou He, right?
Yeah.
So for listeners who are not so familiar with Shanghai, this isn't a story set in Suzhou. This is a little small river that goes through Shanghai, and it's quite an important one in Shanghai. So Karen, could you tell us who this story's by and what it's about?
Yeah, so this is a story about this young man who suddenly finds himself surrounded by overflowing water from Suzhou River. And then it's about his planned meeting with this lady on the bridge. So it's sort of feels like happens between a dream and the reality. It shifts sort of between a very whether he's in a dream or it's a reality. And but I what I find interesting is some characters appeared as he sort of floats around the Suzhou River, and so there's a mention of this European man and this Sikh doorman and the old lady he come across. And again, I feel this is certainly, a modern story, but the story itself, it's more like a continuation of Shanghai from the 1930s. You will probably easily come across a European man, a Sikh kind of doorman, and these are like a roles they play in the history of Shanghai, and that's kind of a stereotype, if you like.
Right.
So, yeah. But I'll let readers to read more about it.
Yeah, so the significance of the Sikh doorman, this is something, again, I would never have guessed before I went to Shanghai, but as soon as it was explained to me, it made sense. So if I understand this correctly, in the international settlement of colonial Shanghai, that part, I think that's modern Huangpu district, that was run by the Americans and also the British, but if I'm remembering right, the British were probably more in charge than the US administration, or whatever you would call it. And this wasn't just Britain as we know it today. This was the British Empire. And the British Empire had a fairly, obviously the quote unquote crown in the jewel in the crown of the British Empire was India, but the Sikh population of India had a pretty good relationship with the the British Empire. So one way that manifested was in Shanghai. A lot of the British police force were Sikhs. So they're fairly ingrained in the memory of the people who lived there, that there were these Sikh police officers working for the British. But yeah, sorry, that explanation was about as long as your answer, but that's just all that history immediately popped into my head as soon as I saw this one little sentence in the story that said there was the Sikh doorman. I thought, wait a minute, what time are we in? But just in general, it's a story that makes you go, wait a minute, what's happening? It's a very kind of dreamy story.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. So I have a little question here about the dreamlike nature of the story. It has a little kind of preface I'll just read. So Suzhou River, or Suzhou Creek as it's often called in English, or Suzhou He in Chinese, that's one of my favorite places in Shanghai. I was always going back to it. Like I said about FOMO, I always felt I was missing out if I wasn't visiting somewhere regularly. So I was always going to, well, not always, but I was often going to Suzhou River. There was all sorts of nice things. There was art galleries, bars. Some of the bridges were just in very nice positions. You can understand why this character would be meeting a girl there, or trying to. And I was told that there's a Chinese movie I should really watch, I think from the 90s, called Suzhou River, which was all about like a romantic story, I think about a guy trying to find a woman who he'd met once, trying to find her again. So I can understand why the story with a kind of a magical or dreamy element would involve Suzhou River. Why do you think the author picked this location in Shanghai for this strange dream story? Why not somewhere else?
I can think of two reasons. One is, I think a river is very important to a city, or generally to the life. Water kind of it's a most important element for any form of life. And I think, and often, a river provides the livelihood for so many peoples. And if you look at a Shanghai map, obviously, I think the obvious one is the Huangpu River. And it's the artery of the city. And it's often, has all these kind of landmarks around the Huangpu River. But if you think about the Huangpu River, certainly the main sections and it's the functions. You see, one is it's mainly for shipbuilding and ports. So along the Huangpu River, that's the industries. And then you have the international trade. So you have the custom house, you have all the historical buildings around the bund, usually set up by international companies, trading houses. So that's what Huangpu River is, for the city. It brings kind of the heavy industries and the commerce. Whereas Suzhou Creek or Suzhou River, if you look at the map, it's a tiny kind of stream in comparison with Huangpu. But actually, it is along this river where people, live around it. And I remember Wang actually has written a novel called Fu Ping. It's all about the sort of working class. They are the bargemen. So they live on a boat and they live on the Suzhou Creek. And that's where actually a lot of the Shanghai rubbish and are shipped out by the barges to the sea. So it is where the life or the day-to-day life happens. So it's not along the Huangpu River because that's too big and, whereas household are built along the banks. But of course, it's also have a lot of warehouses where, they ship up and down, especially to Suzhou. That's where the name comes from. And so I think the author choose Suzhou River. I think it's because it's about that individual young man's life, and I think it has more kind of relevance if it's close to the Suzhou River than any other place. And I think his bathtub can only float on the Suzhou Creek, I guess. If it's in the Huangpu River, it would be overstrong.
Right. That's very true.
Yeah. So, that's how I think.
I'm from, I'm a kind of riverside person myself. I'm from Dundee, which sits on the River Tay, near where it meets the North Sea, I think, where it goes off the east coast of Scotland. And it's totally different again from the Huangpu because it's a much wider river. So Dundee is a much smaller city, so it's just on one side. But I've always liked being near waterways, and all my experience in China was really nice in terms of being near waterways, because in a small town in Zhejiang, you were never too far away from a river or water, because it's Jiangnan. So there was a river or canal that went through town. There were other water towns not far away. And when I was visiting Hangzhou, there were canals, but there's also the end of the really big one, the Grand Canal that goes all the way up to Beijing, which I found totally fascinating. And then in Shanghai, you had the Huangpu, you had Suzhou Creek, and then again other small waterways in the city, serving, I guess, a little bit like you said, like arteries. So I loved it. And when you mentioned the Huangpu, that reminded me of a kind of a dreamlike experience I had on the Huangpu, where I came back had gone on an interesting holiday up to Dongbei. And then I went to Dandong, to the China-North Korea border, got a boat to Korea, went through Korea, then got a boat from South Korea to Shanghai, not Shanghai, Japan. Totally different. And then the last trip of that holiday was a little bit of a strange choice. I took a ferry back from Japan to Shanghai, which the downside was it was 2 nights, which is too long to be on your own on a boat. Not very fun. But I got some amazing views. About early on in the journey, we got some fantastic views of the islands of Japan that we were passing in between. But probably more strong in my memory was the memory of coming up the Huangpu River on the boat. It was one of the strangest things I've done in my life, because you could see the small zoomed in parts, you could see people's houses, you could see little small boats, but then you could see these massive industrial boats, you could see military boats. I guess there's some kind of a naval base there near the Baoshan area. So like you said, it was more of the big scale, the epic scale, than the local scale. But yeah, I don't really have a question there. I just really wanted to tell that story.
And I think, the bridge they are going to meet is the 外白渡桥. I'm pretty sure of it, although it's been never made explicit, but the way they describe the bridge, all the metal bits of it, and because this story, unlike the two stories previously we discussed, the story of Armin and Alphonse Lamp, both, it could just be anywhere in any part of Shanghai. It doesn't have a very specific location. And whereas this one, I can more or less kind of picture in my head which direction he's heading to, which street he's walking on, and which, what he can see, what comes into the view. It's all kind of very, very specific and in these stories. So, I just want to give the comment. I think the meeting place, they say, is the 外白渡桥, which is where the Suzhou Creek meet the Huangpu River, and there's that like a historical bridge, probably built in the 20s and the 30s. So it's very significant in Shanghai history.
There are some, as soon as you said you thought you knew the bridge, I got excited, because I've gone up and down Suzhou Creek enough that I can remember a few of the bridges, and there's more than one nice one. There's some very nice ones, but the one you've just named for us there, the Weibai Du Qiao, and thank you, because I didn't know the Chinese name. I didn't know the English name either, but the Weibai Du Qiao, I think anyone who's walked all the way up the Bund, the Waitan in Shanghai, should know this one. So how would I describe it? If you're walking up the Bund towards the big People's Monument, and at the end, there's this kind of, like you said, a very kind of 20th century style iron bridge that is where the two rivers meet. And if you're looking across the meeting of the rivers, you can see the Russian embassy building and lots of nice kind of 1920s, 30s style buildings. It's right there. And more than once I've met people at that bridge. It's a meeting place.
It's the meeting place, yes.
Yeah, totally. I guess we should mention the author, Cai Jun. So I know his name because he's one of the authors that Amazon Crossing did for their Chinese to English translations. And in their list of Chinese books, his book, English name is The Child's Past Life. It's the only one that is like a horror or supernatural sort of story. So I've looked for information about him online. The most I could learn is that he's China's top horror writer. As far as I'm aware, that's about all you know as well. But have you had any, as the editor, did you have any contact with him, or did you learn much about him?
I'm afraid no. I must, sort of clarify, because this Book of Shanghai, the editors are two sort of colleagues and friends, and they are Jing Li and Dai Chongrong. So I think the kind of day-to-day interaction and is between them and the authors. So I don't have direct contact with Cai Jun. And like you, previously I've not even heard about him, but that just shows that I probably don't read that widely. I only read certain genres I enjoy. So I'm afraid I don't know much about him.
That's okay. For any listeners who are, listening, obviously listeners are listening, but for any listeners who hear me and Karen wondering, who is this guy? If you guys know, there are lots of ways you can give feedback to the show. I'll list them all at the end of this episode, but some of the best ways are Twitter, my Twitter, @AngusLikesWords, and there's a Discord where we have like a group chat, lots of different group chats going. I'll tell you guys where you can get the link to that after the end of the show. But let's move swiftly on to the last of our 4 stories. So Suzhou River, that was kind of a horror story, definitely a genre story, not a totally realistic one. And now we have another story like that by an author who is pretty much generally known as one of the up-and-coming authors of Chinese sci-fi, or sci-fi from China, because it's maybe better to just think of him as a sci-fi writer who is Chinese rather than inventing some imaginary genre called Chinese sci-fi. But anyway, it's TrChFic, and his story is called State of Trance. And I mean, I was already kind of biased towards this story because Chinese sci-fi is something I'm really interested in. But this is definitely one of my favorite stories from this book. This one really caught my attention as I was reading it. So I just wanted to ask, have you found there's been a lot of interest in TrChFic's contribution to this book? Because it seemed to me like there was, but then I'm probably very biased here and seeing what I'm used to seeing, which is Chinese sci-fi.
Yeah. Actually, TrChFic came to our Manchester Literature Festival last year. So I met him in person. And because his English is very good, so I think, in a way, I think, sort of having the media interviews, it's all much easier. So I think recently he was on the BBC World Service. Yeah, and I think, obviously, as you said, science fiction, Chinese science fiction really came into people's attention in the last couple of years. I think following the publication of the Three-Body Problem, I was meeting some friend and someone just said, have you read the book? I said, never heard about it. And then they say, oh, in my company, everyone is reading about it. And so it's, by that time, it suddenly sort of occurred to me, okay, there's that interest. And that's why last year we brought 2 young science fiction writers to Manchester. And one of them, you both interviewed them, TrChFic and Xia. So, yeah, I think, I'm sure he's still very much kind of, in the media, if you like, and which is a good thing. And, yeah, so I like him, and he's very easygoing, personable.
Yeah, he gave me a high five. That was the last interaction I had with him.
Oh, I see.
I should give the context here. So I think their visit to Manchester is something that would link us by 2 or 3 degrees of separation, because I ended up getting invited to the conference on Chinese genre fiction that Xia and TrChFic attended. And so that was a way I was able to introduce myself to them. And that's ultimately how they ended up being guests on my show. But I guess the reason they were there is, if I'm understanding correctly, is because you helped arrange their visit. Is that right?
That's right. So were you at the conference in Leeds?
Yes, I was at the conference in Leeds. I could have stuck around for the other events they did in Manchester, but I went to Ilkley instead to see Yang speak, partly so I could introduce myself to more authors, but partly so I didn't annoy Xia and TrChFic following them around everywhere.
I see. Yes, yeah. No, we worked with the Leeds Center for Chinese Writings, and so when we decided to bring them over, and we were saying, it's good for them to visit a number of universities and do different activities. So yeah, that's how it all came about. So which works out quite well.
Fantastic. Yeah. What a cool thing. But anyway, let's talk about State of Trance. So I've got a little bit of another intro to my question. I'm just going to read it off the page again. So this story deals with the dissolving of human consciousness into, I think the phrase primordial chaos is used in the story. If not, that's the sense I got. It's like some very primitive state. And I'm going to interrupt my question here because I learned about this kind of concept of primordial chaos when I was trying to type in the Chinese for wonton into my phone, hundun, because my knowledge of Chinese tones is really bad. But if for some reason, if you try and put the the Chinese for wonton, hundun, into my phone's predictive text, it gives you the wrong hundun. It gives you the chaos hundun. So I put that, I don't know, I think it gave me the wrong meaning. I put it into my dictionary app, and this word I thought that meant a kind of dumpling gave me this crazy term from mythology. So that was kind of what was on my mind as I was reading the story. But anyway, I'll keep going with the question. So human consciousness is dissolving, and there's a main character who's narrating the story. And his way of dealing with this kind of end of the world situation is to go on one last desperate mission. But the mission isn't saving the world, it's returning a book to Shanghai Library. And from what I gathered, it's not a random library in Shanghai, it's the Shanghai Library, which is very central. It's quite an old building. It's a nice building. It has its own metro stop in the city's underground system. Just doesn't go into the library, but it stops next door, and it's named after it. It's in Shuhui district, I think in the old French concession, but certainly in a very nice part of Shuhui. And Wikipedia told me it's the second largest library in the world, in China, and one of the biggest ones in the world. So really, I guess, a significant place for his to be his destination and his mission. But what I want to ask you as just a reader is, why do you think that's this character's mission before his mind totally dissolves?
Okay, yeah. I think, my take on is, I think by sort of, returning this book to the Shanghai Library, I think he raised lots of questions about knowledge, and knowledge in the form of book, and also the Chinese exam systems. And, we kind of revere knowledge, and, and traditionally, Chinese, you study so you can become a government officials. You have that imperial exam system.
Yeah, and
it still carries on.
That's
so
ancient,
I think,
right? That's a really old tradition.
Yeah, so I think I'm just guessing, whether that's his intention. He used the science fiction kind of genre to really raise these age-old questions, how we see knowledge, and especially knowledge in the form of books, and how, people, because it talk about, it certainly give me the impression that the repression of this knowledge, kind of, he used the word tomb-like hierarchy. It's, people accumulate a lot of knowledge so they can get on the kind of the ladder of the society, and then, does the knowledge define who you are? And I think there's a lot of philosophical questions, and using a book and a library maybe enable him to bring out all these questions, and in a subtle way make us think, especially if the world is coming to the end, what is the important things? And so in that, again, I feel it's very, very Chinese. Even science fiction probably is a very Western form, but the topic, the contents, or the subject he wants to deal with, it's very reflecting the Chinese thinking. That's my take on.
Yeah, I do know that that's something he's interested in. I think, from what I gathered, some writers or people who talk about Chinese sci-fi think it's better if it doesn't try to tell some story about the country. It should just exist as its own thing. But I know TrChFic is kind of interested in doing something special with the sci-fi he writes so that it can have its own tradition. Because I guess some of our listeners might not know the kind of issue here is that sci-fi really is an imported genre. And a lot of the Chinese sci-fi fans read it's like the quote unquote the classics by a lot of American and other foreign sci-fi writers. And so this is fresh in my head because I recently joined a big Zoom meeting, or Zoom, how can I say that? A Zoom event. It was hosted by Yale University, and it had authors attending were Chen Shufan, Xia Jia, and Han Song, so a slightly older Chinese sci-fi writer. And there was some discussion of this idea of should Chinese, or can can or should Chinese sci-fi writers try to make a special, like a version of sci-fi that expresses something about China? And it seemed, from what I remember, the author who seemed most enthusiastic and had the most to say about that was Chen Qiufan, although he kind of stressed he's not sure exactly what a real Chinese sci-fi would look like, but it's kind of something he's playing with or trying to do as an author. Yeah, so I think you're onto something there for sure. When you mentioned like the focus on the form of a book and philosophical ideas, that's given me an idea right away, which I guess is a sign the story is doing its work. It's making us think. So have you ever heard of the kind of philosophical concept, the extended mind? Have you heard that phrase?
No.
Right. So it's a good philosophical concept because it's an easy one to understand. It's kind of quite common sense. So the idea of the extended mind is that humans, technically for thousands of years, humans have done things to kind of let their mind exist outside of their body. So, and it's a way to enhance ourselves or to outsource things that we would normally have to try hard on. So to give you some like low-tech examples, making a shopping list is a way of extending your memory because you put something you need to remember into a form where it's fixed and you can't lose it. So the philosophical idea is that by writing a shopping list, you've extended your mind onto the paper. Or like another idea, having a calculator on your phone is an extended mind because you maybe could do those calculations with your organic mind, but your extended mind in the phone is more efficient. And just smartphones in general are, if you apply the idea of an extended mind to them, they're crazy devices because they have like a collective mind on the internet. But like, I guess if you applied that to books and maybe some of the things you're saying about the Chinese tradition of having knowledge, not just stories, but knowledge in a book. If you know that your brain, if your physical or biological mind is about to turn into, nothing, if you're about to vanish as a person, it would make sense to try and, I guess one way of looking at it is the simple idea that in our writing, we live on beyond our death or whatever. But maybe that philosophical way of looking at it would be our mind can survive whatever is happening in the story. Or I guess the book he's returning, he didn't write, but at least there's some human mind in one way on that page, and he's bringing it back to this big collection. So yeah, there's a thought I had about 5 minutes ago based on
I see. Yes,
inspired by your answer.
I think, that certainly I don't know true or false, so UK intellects and there's the Chinese intellects, I think, have that strong desire, feel like if anything they can leave beyond their death, it's the books, they feel that will keep them alive, But so, most of educated people, if anything you ask them, they will say, oh, I want to, have written a book or something. But sometimes I wonder, with so many books published, and I think whether you can still leave your traces beyond your death through the books, that's questionable. It's not like before there's a limited number of books and, in one way or another it get preserved. But now there's sort of huge number of books, and if it hasn't got impact, it's probably forgotten very quickly.
Yeah.
Just an observation in the comments, and
I think it's totally it's a thought I've had, like, gosh, I need to try really hard and write a book, or if I can't write a book, I'll make this podcast and then I can exist in some way on the internet forever. But then, what if the service that is holding my files gets taken down? And even if it doesn't, who's to say anyone will be listening to this in even just a few years? Possibly nobody. I guess I really don't know if this would be an example of a cultural difference or just a difference or just something that's universal. But I think before I ever heard the idea of living forever in a book, I remember it was watching the movie Troy, so based on Homer's Iliad, the story of the siege of Troy. So one of the oldest quote unquote stories from Western culture. There's a scene where again, this is not from the book. This is from the Hollywood version where it's Brad Pitt. He's playing the hero Achilles. And I think is it his mother that tells him, look, you can live forever if you are a hero, if you become famous. So I guess in some ways, I don't know if this is a Western perspective or just a different perspective with no geographic location attached. But yeah, being in a book might not be enough. You might want to be famous if you want your name to survive. I had a scary thought actually about this recently. I thought about my great-grandparents. So I only ever knew one of them, my great-grandmother. I think that's my mum's dad's mum. And I've heard a lot of stories in the family about my great-grandfather, who is my dad's dad's dad. But that's two out of lots of great-grandparents who I know pretty much nothing about. So if even, and that's only 3 generations ago. So I don't mean to take our conversation too far away from the story or make things really dark, but just a thought I had about that, about how maybe not like I guess in this story, things are dissolving very quickly, but maybe in time, everything like this just dissolves.
Yeah, but also I think, it's also he's raising the question of discovering yourself, even at the very end, whether it's at this perilous moment, that kind of reflection and who you are is equally important. And that's what goes through his mind when he was on his way to the library. And so, yeah, it's I think humans forever pursuing, who we are and what's the purpose. And so I think, again, in this particular story, I found those big questions is certainly, to my mind, is being raised. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. It's very easy to feel like you're on the side of the main character, because his mission is definitely a mission anyone would identify with, just because it's, like you said, it's a very human thing to do, to just keep going, trying to do something meaningful, even when all the odds are against you. Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's all the questions I've got about our 4 stories discussed in great depth. I think we've just, with Shanghai as a starting point, we've talked about so many myriad things, everything from management of waste to the very first shops and like the very first market economy that China saw. We've talked about meeting places in the city, and we've gone all the way to how we can live forever in books. So all sorts of destinations I didn't quite expect, which is, I think that's appropriate for Shanghai, because Shanghai, my experience in Shanghai anyway, there's all sorts of things waiting for you that you would never expect. So you told us earlier you were staying in Shanghai in the 80s. So if you don't mind me asking, can I ask how that came about, but also over time, like how could you describe the connection that you built up with Shanghai, and how do you feel about it now?
Yeah. So I grown up in Hangzhou, which is not far from Shanghai, but I went to Shanghai to do my university degrees. So that's how I came to live and study in Shanghai. And that is in the early 1980s. So at that time, Shanghai is still kind of closed in a sense because the restriction of movement, we have a hukou, household sort of a resident card. So basically, not like now, anyone can come in and find a job to work in Shanghai, except university students. You come from different part of the country and you study there. And I think the very important thing is if you go to shops and if you don't speak Shanghai dialect, you don't get service because,
right.
It's the state economy and the people kind of, they not that kind of, at least on the surface, not so welcoming to kind of people because, they generally think Shanghai is more industrialized and much more kind of sophisticated. So anyone from outside Shanghai, they call it like a country pumpkins. And so I think the first thing we learned is to learn Shanghai dialect. And luckily, in our university dormitory, we've got 7 people share a room. And I think 3 from Shanghai and the rest are from like Jiangsu and Zhejiang. But they all encourage us to learn the language. And I think that definitely put us in a good position to kind of feel more part of the Shanghai. So I've lived there for 15 years before I moved to the UK. So it is very important because that's when I went to the university, formed a lot of friendship, had my first jobs, got married, and started my family. So that's why I feel very, very close to the city. And the most important, I speak the dialect, so you feel more part of the city.
Right.
So that's my connection. But since I came to the UK, I still go back every year, and I still got families and friends who I meet and colleagues, former colleagues. So, yeah.
Fantastic. That's reminded me, I think I only, off the top of my head, I only remember 2 things in Shanghainese. One is Nong Hao instead of Ni Hao, and Zigawe instead of Shujiahui, the area I used to work in. And I vaguely remember there was one bus I rode from the south of Shuhui, the school I was working at, up into the center. The bus was going to Shujiahui, and I think the bus was speaking in 3 languages. It was speaking in the bus speaker, the Tannoy system. It had Putonghua, so standard Mandarin. It had English, and I'm pretty certain it also had Shanghainese. But I only noticed that if I was listening for it. If I didn't listen for it, it just sounded like, Chinese that I wasn't paying attention to. But
yeah.
It's fascinating. At least for an outsider, I was amazed, but I never made any efforts to learn the Shanghainese. Is your Shanghainese still there, or has it faded a bit over time?
I think it's still there. I think I need kind of environment, if someone speak the dialect, and then, you can go into the conversation. Yeah, so things is still very much there. But even Shanghai dialect has evolved, since my time. So now the young people who speak Shanghai dialect speak some slightly different ones, I think.
Right.
So I guess like any language, it's constant evolving, new vocabulary, new accent, because all depends on where the people coming from. I think, they will change the accent or the use of the words. And it's, but talking to my former colleagues, and I think, we all speak the same language.
I remember I mentioned that colleague before who was from the quite old Shanghai family. And so he spoke good English. Speaking to students or staff, he would speak Mandarin. But sometimes you'd hear him on the phone, I guess, just talking to his bros, I guess, or his family maybe, and he would use the Shanghainese. And at least to my ears, I was like, whoa, this is actually really different from Mandarin. This is, I can only barely recognize some of the sounds. But that question doesn't go anywhere, just a memory that sprung to my head. So I mentioned about Suzhou Creek, Suzhou River, that story was a fun one for me because that's a place that was not just a place I remember, but one of my favorite places in Shanghai, which is a city with so many great places. It's special that somewhere should be up in your favorites. So I want to ask you, did any of these stories take you back to your favorite places, as well as Suzhou Creek? And what are those favorite places?
I must admit, Suzhou River is not some place I go regularly. I remember going to the post office, if you ever been walking on the Suzhou Creek, and there's that famous post office. And I remember just before I came to the UK, if you want to post anything overseas, you go to that big post office. Wow. And but it's not an area I go regularly, but about 3 years ago, my hobby is walking. So I just decided to walk quite a big section of it. And I noticed the changes, and unbelievable. It is very nice, they have a walkway. So basically you can walk along all the way to the bund. And so that's probably my sort of very recent experiences. So in terms of favorite places or places I have regular activity and I know most well is Nanjing Xilu. So basically from Chengdu Lu, where the highways, the sort of Nanbei Gaojia, so it's the south to the north, which cut Chengdu Lu from that all the way to Jing'an Temple. So that's the section where I have regular activities, and it's partly because my uncle lived there, and when I was at university, I visit them every week. It's more like my weekend sort of home, and so my uncle and aunt, they have died, but my cousin still lives in the same house. It's a 1930s apartment.
Oh wow!
So it's really nice, and like a Shanxi. Yeah, there are lots of little shops and clothes shops and food stores, and so that's where a lot of probably my favorite bits. It's partly because of familiarity, partly of reminiscence. I spent my 20s, 30s there.
Yeah. Fantastic. What was I going to say? Yeah, that walkway on Suzhou Creek you described, that's exactly the thing I like to do. Walk along that one. And the other thing that I remembered there, so I have happy memories of Jing'an Temple for quite different reasons. I used to go to a writer's workshop that was held in one of the buildings just near Jing'an Temple, Jing'an. And so I have happy memories of going to the workshop and meeting friends. But what I would often do was show up early, and because just opposite Jing'an Temple, there's the Jing'an Park. And this is going to sound very stupid, and my American friends thought this was very stupid, because in that park there's a Dunkin' Donuts, and to an American that's like not an exciting thing. That's a very normal shop, but it's something I'd only ever seen in like Berlin, because there's a lot of Dunkin' Donuts in Berlin. We don't really have, basically we have none in the UK. And one of my favorite things in the world is a donut with icing on top. And
I see.
yeah, and that particular Dunkin' Donuts was a place where you could get quite nice donuts in Shanghai, and it was a lovely place to just sit. You could sit out the front, out the back, or inside, and I have very happy memories sitting in that donut shop before crossing the road just near the temple to go to the workshop.
Yes.
But yeah.
But do you know that Jing'an Temple used to be the International Cemetery?
The park, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
not
I did.
Not the park. Sorry, not the temple, the park. Yes. Exactly.
Yes. Yeah. I think I might have learned that one when I was quite new in Shanghai and trying to explore. I found some lists and walks, and the walks took me to fantastic places, and one of them, it wasn't a walk, but it was a list of places you could visit, and it was like haunted or spooky places in Shanghai, and some of the stories were really quite dark. So one of them was a place actually very near the school, the Longhua Martyrs Cemetery, where a lot of the victims of the Kuomintang were executed. So that was one of them. And another one was the Jing'an Park, because although it's not, I think it's not clearly signposted anywhere. Yeah, it's built on top of the foreigners' cemetery. So, of course, the article said something silly like maybe you'll see the ghost of some.
Yeah, no, it is nice. Kind of in the city, you have that green park, and yes.
Yeah, it had some very cute cats in that park too, if I remember correctly. But yeah, I would love to make a 5-hour podcast talking about all my favorite places in Shanghai, but unfortunately this is a books podcast, so I can't do that. So we should just keep going. So here's a couple of miscellaneous questions. I've tried to ask these every episode. The first one is about like a word of the day. Could you recommend our listeners a word of the day, something that maybe captures something from one of our stories, or just something about Shanghai in general?
Yeah. I think I mentioned the story of army Wang, the use of language, especially
Mm.
Shanghai dialect, and I think that might be the only Chinese character appeared in the whole book. It's called Shanghai 话叫出拉西 means I think it's been translated as grasping the rubbish, which we had a lot of debate about whether which verb to use. Basically you clasp or collect the rubbish, but in Shanghai dialects it's called 出拉西.
Right. Can you say that slowly so I can repeat it?
出拉机
出拉机.
出拉西
出拉西, okay. And is there a way to say that in like standard Mandarin, or does that one only exist in, like, is there no way
I think it's only exist in Shanghai dialect. It's
Right.
a very vivid kind of both the sound and action and and I think it's probably the most difficult word to translate, or I've seen so many different versions of translating that phrase, and
Right.
Everyone has probably their reason why it should be. And I think finally we go for grasping, because that's when they picked up arming as a person from the rubbish bin. So if you're using a clasping or other verb, that's just not forceful enough, when he uses a grasping, so you grasp a person from the rubbish bin. But yeah, that will be my word of the story.
That's a good choice. After we're done, I might message you on WeChat to see if there's a way I can get it into my show notes, because normally it's easy for me. If the guest will say a word, no problem. I can usually write the pinyin and get the characters myself. I put them in Google Translate. It gives me the pinyin with the correct tones, no problem. And then the English translation, no problem. But this time, I guess I'll have to try a little bit harder, make a bit more effort to see if we can get this Shanghainese in the show notes. But don't worry, we'll figure that out. Here's the next silly question. If Shanghai was a drink, or if this book was a drink, what kind of drink do you think it would be?
I must admit, I know very little about drinks, whether it's the names or the taste of it. So when I think about this question, say, I probably go for something, a rice wine.
That sounds sensible.
Yeah, it's kind of, if I think of Shanghai, it's easier to come up with a dish, like rather than a drink. And, if it has to be a dish, then I will say it's a braised pork, 红烧肉. And
Yum.
Yeah, and usually the Chinese, the Shanghai cooking, traditional Shanghai cooking, use a lot of soy sauce and the white rice wine, and it's all very dark color. Until sort of the overseas style 海派, 就是sort of Shanghai style of cooking, which take on a lot of the international elements of it, then it can look very different. But if you talk about the very local Shanghai cooking, they use a lot of dark soy sauce and the rice wine. So if I have to name a drink after for Shanghai, and that's probably the drink I'm familiar with. Again, it's very warm. It's a bit like a dark color, but it certainly emit that kind of warmth, which you will probably need, and that's how I can think of.
Right. That makes sense to me. Is that rice wine, do you mean Huangjiu, or is it a different wine?
Yeah, Huangjiu.
Oh, cool. I once, I think the first time I came back from China, from small town Doxing, I brought some baijiu with me, and I tried giving it to my dad and also my stepdad, and they're both like, oh! Like I think my dad had tried it before, but they were like shocked by how strong it was. But at least they could understand it, because they'd had other similar spirits in their lives, like vodka. But the next time I did bring back a little bit of baijiu, but I also brought back some Wangjiu, and they were, I guess, much more curious about the huangjiu because it's more
very different.
Yeah, totally different and different from anything they'd had before. And yeah.
And I think, Shanghai and Jiangnan, we kind of, our main staple food is rice. So I think, the rice wine is very unique in the region, kind of, it's I guess, and it's also daily necessity
right.
in our cooking, yes. So it is for drinking, but it's also for daily cooking, and you always put rice wine, and But it's very different. I have friends who came to Hangzhou with me, and I served them all different Chinese drinks. I think they found rice wine is probably the hardest to comprehend, sort of, or even to like it. And I wouldn't want to say Chinese culture is inaccessible, but certainly it takes a long time to kind of appreciate all the kind of, different flavors. And so that's how I think.
I think, it matches my experience, like coming to China as a foreigner. Some things they're globalized, I'm already familiar with them, no problem. Other things, they are specific to China or Asia, but there's nothing too strange for me about them, so I could get my head around them. So I'm trying to think, can I quickly think of an example? Well, maybe like baijiu. Okay, you can't really get it in the UK, but I understand the concept of a very strong spirit. And then there's other things that take a little bit more time to appreciate. Can I think of an example? Maybe not quickly. You mentioned hai pai, that's reminded me of two little stories. So about hai pai and hong shao rou, there was a series of cooking videos I watched one time. It was published by Vice, and it was about this guy Eddie Huang, he's a Chinese American, and he's I think he's involved in making like a TV drama fresh off the boat these days about immigrant families. But before that, he was like a TV or online chef, focusing I think mostly on Chinese food. And he did a series where he visited Shanghai, and he visited local chefs to see what they were doing. And one of the things he did was do like a cooking battle. So the challenge was he had to make some hong shao rou, and this Shanghai chef had to make some hong shao rou. And so the Shanghai chef took like the standard approach, and Eddie Huang cooked his, instead of huangjiu, he used Coca-Cola. So there's an interesting example.
And the result?
It turned out good, but he wasn't as good as the hong shao rou master. But apparently it did taste okay. And when you were talking about huangjiu, I actually have a huangjiu kind of hai pai story. This one's from Moganshan. In my first year in China, I was out there in that small town, and I didn't have many connections with other foreigners. But there was this English lady who lived outside of the town on Moganshan, and I think she said, "Are you doing anything with your Christmas?" And I said, "No, there's nothing I can do really. I could maybe go to Hangzhou." And she said, "Well, come on over. We can do something Christmassy." And she decided she was going to make mince pies, so like a very British kind of Christmas tradition. And she was just using her knowledge to get as many of the ingredients as she could. But sometimes the classical ingredient wasn't there, so she needed to improvise. So a mince pie, I guess you're familiar with mince pie, is like the inside isn't really a mince. It's not really meat. It's like sweetened fruit and stuff. So in a traditional recipe, you need to put some brandy on it. But she was on this mountain, Moganshan, so there's no brandy. But her solution was to get some huangjiu and put that on instead. And again, it worked pretty nicely.
Very good. Yes. It's versatile. That's good.
It's a handy thing to know if you're ever on a mountain and you want to make mince pies. So there's our miscellaneous questions all done. Now we're on to like kind of just our final questions before we say goodbye. So I want to ask you, what are you reading just now? And also, are there any books, they could be Chinese or they don't have to be Chinese, that you'd like to recommend to our listeners?
Yeah, I think if people interested in Shanghai and keep on reading stories about Shanghai, I would recommend the Inspector Chen mysteries. Because I'm myself a crime thriller fan, which is no big deal, and I'm always looking for crime stories about Shanghai or China. There are not many, especially written in English, so I happened to sort of come across Zhuō, who is based in America, but all his Inspector Chen stories happen in Shanghai. And what I particularly like is it's sort of kind of contemporary. So it's because often, historical and which is important, is good. But I think, his stories is about sort of, contemporary China, contemporary Shanghai, and the legal systems, and so it's a good window to look the changes in Shanghai, and because it's a series, so he keep producing books, and that's what I enjoy, and I hope other people would enjoy it as well. I'm also not surprised, a big fan of Amy Tan, so I read her book, and I really want to bring her to Manchester someday, but I know she's very how can I put it? It's not cheap to bring her over. So I think, So I think she is also from Shanghai, and I think what she writes about reflect a lot of the common kind of feelings about kind of Chinese immigrants living in whether in the United States or UK. So I think I feel I can relate to, resonate to, and then I think in terms of my current reading, I read all sorts of things, and I recently finished a book called The Divide by Alan Akbon. He's a playwright, and I really enjoy his plays. And this is his first book. Published when he's 80. So that probably, just shows at any age you can write a book.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Cool. Thanks for that.
It's all just a very random bits I read.
Oh, that's cool. All recommendations are useful. I wonder, I'm asking this because this is a book I previously covered on the show. Have you read any of Chen Sijin's crime books? Because he's a Hangzhou writer who I think he's right.
So how do you recommend it? Yeah.
Okay, so
what's his name?
So I apologize if I'm not doing the tones correctly, but Chen Sijin. So Chen and Zijin, Z-I. Jin, Jin. The reason I stumbled across this, it's because of the conference in Leeds I went to, where Chen Qiufan and Xia were. For part of it, I was sat next to the translator Michelle Dieter, and I think near the end she just passed me this book, The Untouched Crime. If my Mandarin was better, I would remember the Chinese title. There's a Chinese TV show. I'll keep talking, but as I'm talking, I'm going to Google this book so that I can get the Chinese name up. But basically, he's a Chinese writer living in Hangzhou, near the kind of university area, I believe. And he sets his stories there. I think in the English, it says it's in Hangzhou. I think in the Chinese, it's called H City or something. It's kept unspecified. But his book, The Untouched Crime, is one of the books that Amazon Crossing brought into English with Michelle Dieter translating it. Now I've brought up my own episode on it because I know it has the there's my own voice because I know it has the pinyin title. Info Wu Zheng Zhuzui. The Untouched Crime. Right. Yeah. So yeah.
Good. Thank you. And yes, I'm very excited. I hope he has. I guess this is a book translated, but he must have.
There's an original Chinese too.
Books, and yes, very good. And I look forward to reading it. And I know Michelle quite well. And so I didn't realize she never mentioned she translated that book. And so it must be quite recent. Yeah, if it's last year, then
I think
good.
I think most of Amazon Crossing's Chinese books are from not too long ago. But yeah, this is one of them. And yeah, I believe he does have quite a few that are untranslated. And as I mentioned, there's a TV show, but the TV show you might not, well, it's still got the crime element, but they shifted the setting from Hangzhou to Dongbei, in one of the cities in the northeast. Maybe they wanted the kind of cold setting. I don't know. But yeah.
So that's my kind of a dream. Someday I will write a crime thriller at age of 80.
Yeah, it's a good thing to do with your 80th year, I guess. Okay, last question of all, or at least last question I have on the paper. Do you want to take the chance to promote any projects or platforms beyond just the Book of Shanghai?
I think this book can sort of, as a project, kind of come to fruition. It's yes, I have that passion, and but also I think Confucius Institute, we promote language and culture through all sorts of art forms, and the literature is a really important form, I think, among all the forms that we sort of use. And so I really just feel we can continue to do this work through the Confucius Institute, because I actually visit St. Petersburg Confucius Institute. They have brought a lot of Chinese short story collections to Russian language.
Oh, fantastic.
And they actually done the Kunming. They've done lots of sort of, not necessarily big cities, but like regions. And yes, I know the professor who works with Chinese Writers Association. I think that's where he sourced all these writers and short stories. And they've done some fantastic work. And so I think that's probably I would like to just promote. And we also, the Manchester Confucius Institute, we also have a Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. So I think it would be good, once you have this on your social media, we can cross-promoting it.
Absolutely, yeah. And for listeners, I'll put links to all the Manchester Confucius Institute's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram in the show notes, so in the episode description for you guys, for your convenience, I guess. And I should just, if I can, just throw in myself. In my first year back in the UK, when I was in Edinburgh studying my publishing masters, I was looking for a place to do a little bit of kind of not too heavy but useful study of Chinese, because I was doing a part-time job and my studies, and the best place I could find was the Confucius Institute, because they were offering a weekly free, like a conversation club. And yeah, I ended up actually being the only student who was attending, so I had to let them know if I could make it or not, because otherwise there would be no class. But the teacher was always there, always happy to chat, and yeah, it was just a very positive experience I had. So that was the Edinburgh one. That's the only one I've visited, but it was a really great. I learned a little bit more Chinese, and I preserved the Chinese I already have, if that makes sense. It's kind of stopped it from fading away.
Yeah, it's very good. It's interesting because one of the Shanghai editors, Dai Congrong, she's the Chinese director at Edinburgh Confucius Institute.
Oh.
So she was the director. I just sort of randomly, she sent out email, and I thought, oh, she might be the potential person I can work with. And I don't know her personally. I just call her, and that's how the book came about. So it's kind of, the Confucius Institute, and she was at Edinburgh for 2 years. And so we only met once in Sheffield, very briefly. And I give her the Tokyo book. I said, this is the format we're going to follow, and think about it.
There you go.
So it's all the connections, yes. So You're right, it's the pink cover of Tokyo book. And the Ra told me, so far of all the city series, Tokyo is probably, the most popular one. And I said to him, Shanghai will be the one on the same par, if not more popular, I hope, in terms of readership, because I think both Tokyo and Shanghai hold people's fascination.
Definitely, they exist. Yeah. There's a Scottish author I really like called Alistair Gray, and his most famous book is called Lanark, and it's set in Glasgow, and he's this guy. He's a bit of he's a Scottish nationalist, so it's not the prime focus of the book, but one of the themes, it's about like people's identity as Scottish or even as Glaswegians living in the city of Glasgow. And one of the characters says that the problem facing Scotland or Scottish people is that, or at least maybe Glasgow, because Edinburgh is a special case, but for Glasgow and most of the other Scottish cities, they aren't places where people imagine living. The places which are easiest to feel the most proud of or are the most special are the places that other people imagine living. So, I mean, I guess maybe Edinburgh in Scotland has this romantic image or a literary image, but as soon as you see that character's dialogue, you immediately know what he's talking about. And it would be very cool if Shanghai comes to exist in the kind of world imagination in the same way Tokyo does. I think certainly. I don't see why not. It is a magical city, so.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. And I think on that note, I'll just say thanks for coming on the show and having such a fantastic chat and giving such great answers to these questions. And thanks for letting me dredge up some of my memories of Shanghai, because they're pretty much all amazing memories.
Good. Thank you for having me on.
So thank you once again to Karen Wang. That really was a great chat, and it was lovely to take a little mental journey back along the streets and shukumen and elevated roads of Shanghai. Really, that was nice. A little piece of time travel for me and maybe anyone else listening who's been to Shanghai but isn't there right now. And a nice piece of self-indulgence, I guess, for everyone who is listening there right now. So there's nothing else for me to say except do the plugs for the show. So if you want to keep up with the show on social media and keep up with me, I guess, on social media, there are places you can do that. On Twitter, you can go to @AngusLikesWords. That's my kind of personal account, but basically everything I tweet is related to the show or to Chinese fiction. If you're an Instagram user, the show has its own Instagram account. It's @TrChFic. That's also a good way to keep up with the show. I try to share cool Chinese literature related things I see to like little story there. You can message me in the old Instagram DMs. It's a fun place to be, I would say. If you'd like to support the show materially, which means help me fund my tea addiction, my crippling tea addiction, and also help support me pay the hosting fees for the show, there's two places that you can do that. One is the Patreon. Now, the pro of Patreon for you is that you get access to hours and hours of bonus content. I've got episodes queued up that will come out week by week, pretty much. I'm finding more time to put into that, which is good news for us all. So that's the pro for you, is the bonus content. The pro for me is that you can give a monthly contribution, which obviously that's it's money. Money's good for me. If you'd like to give a one-off contribution, if you don't like the idea of giving me money every month, if you'd rather just, proverbially speaking, buy me a coffee, well then you can go to buymeacoffee.com and you can give a one-off contribution. So both those places, just put in the website's URL and then /TrChFic on the end, TrChFic. Both those links will be in the show notes. So yeah, that's how to support the show with money, but here's an even better way, spreading the word. I really do think this is the best thing you can do. So if you know someone who might like this podcast, maybe they like books, maybe they like books from Asia, maybe they like books from China, maybe they're interested in China, maybe they just like podcasts, maybe they like insane discussions about how to outlive death via books. Maybe they like Shanghai, maybe they like Chinese sci-fi and they'll only listen to the Chinese sci-fi episodes. Perfectly reasonable, whatever the case. you should tell them. Tell your teachers, tell your friends, tell your disintegrating librarian, and tell your local fruit shop vendor. Tell all those people if you happen to have them. If you don't have them, then it's a problem easily solved. Just go to Shanghai. Until you do, 再见.